The gesture came so suddenly and with such unmistakable authority that the entire studio seemed to stop breathing. Denzel's hand wasn't raised in anger, nor was his tone overtly hostile, but there was something in the way he moved, something commanding, calm and final, that cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Joy's words died mid-sentence. Her eyes darted toward him, wide and startled, as if realizing too late that the balance of power had shifted. For a moment, nobody said a word. The air itself felt charged, thick with tension and something close to reverence. You could almost hear the hum of the studio lights, the faint buzz of electricity running through the cameras, the rustle of a microphone cable somewhere off to the side. And then Denzel spoke again, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "You know what really gets me, Joy?" he began, leaning forward slightly. His gaze was steady, measured, not cruel but heavy with disappointment. "It's not that you disagree with me. It's not even that you try to twist my message or put words in my mouth. What really gets me is the disrespect. The casual, thoughtless disrespect that people like you think you can get away with because you're sitting behind that desk, holding the microphone, and I'm just a guest on your show." A ripple of silence spread through the room. Even the camera operators, usually hidden behind their lenses, froze where they stood. The floor manager stopped gesturing. The sound technician's hand hovered uncertainly over the control board. It felt as if the entire production had been placed under a spell that Denzel Washington himself had cast without needing to raise his voice. Joy sat motionless in her chair. Her lips parted as if to form a response, but no words came. The practiced confidence that usually marked her on-air persona, the sharp humor, the quick comebacks, the sense that she always controlled the narrative, had vanished. What replaced it was something unfamiliar, a flicker of fear or maybe realization. For the first time since the cameras started rolling, she seemed to understand that she had gone too far. Denzel's tone sharpened, not in anger, but in conviction. "You think because you've been on television for a few years that gives you the right to talk down to me?" His voice rose slightly, not in volume but in gravity, each word landing like a gavel strike. "You think that just because you've got a camera pointed at you, because you've got a platform and an audience, that means you can dismiss my experiences, my community, my truth as if it's all one-sided or biased?" The audience, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, remained perfectly silent. Even the usual coughs, whispers, and shifting in seats had ceased. All eyes were locked on the exchange, as though the entire set had transformed into a courtroom. And Denzel Washington was both witness and judge. Joy tried to recover her composure, but her voice betrayed her. "Denzel, please," she stammered. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The words sounded fragile, almost childlike. "I never meant to disrespect you. I have nothing but admiration for your work, for your career. I've always admired your honesty." For a split second there was a flicker of something, maybe pity, in Denzel's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a look of solemn disbelief. He let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that comes not from amusement, but from exhaustion, from hearing the same excuses one too many times. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his eyebrows raised. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, Joy. The only misunderstanding here is your belief that you could sit across from me, question my integrity, challenge my motivations, and try to strip meaning from the stories I tell, and somehow think that was acceptable." His words rolled out evenly, but each one struck with the weight of a hammer. "You don't get to define my truth just because you have the louder microphone." The control booth behind the glass was alive with frantic motion. Producers exchanged panicked looks, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment play out. But no one dared to interrupt. Something about the atmosphere, about Denzel's presence, made even the idea of breaking the silence feel sacrilegious. Joy's eyes flicked toward the booth, her face pale. She was searching for help, for rescue, but none came. The control room remained frozen, and she realized she was completely on her own. The bright studio lights, once her allies, now felt like interrogation lamps exposing every insecurity she had tried to hide behind charm and confidence. Denzel leaned back slightly, his expression softening, but his words remained razor-sharp. "You know, I've sat in this chair many times before," he said quietly. "I've had journalists ask hard questions. I've had critics challenge my choices, my beliefs, my art. That's part of the job. I respect that. But there's a line between questioning and belittling, between curiosity and contempt. And you crossed that line the moment you decided that your opinion mattered more than understanding. The audience could see tears starting to form in Joy's eyes, though she tried to hide them with a trembling smile. I didn't mean for it to sound that way, she whispered. Denzel nodded slowly. Intentions are easy, he said. We all have good intentions. But respect? That's a choice you make every time you open your mouth. You chose not to listen. You chose to assume. You chose to talk at me instead of with me, and now you're realizing what that choice costs. For the first time, Joy didn't have a comeback. Her usual composure, her ability to turn any confrontation into a segment win had evaporated. She looked across the table and saw not a movie star, but a man. Calm, proud, unflinching, who refused to let his dignity be trampled for the sake of entertainment. When Denzel finally leaned back and folded his hands, the silence stretched on like an echo. The audience didn't know whether to clap, gasp, or simply sit in awe. Even Joy seemed uncertain whether the interview was over, or if she was supposed to continue. At last Denzel spoke again, his tone quieter now, but still filled with gravity. I came here to talk about my work, about the stories that matter to me, he said. Not to be dissected, not to be accused, and not to be reduced to headlines. You invited me here as a guest. All I asked for was the respect that any guest deserves. There was no anger in his face anymore, just clarity. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and looked briefly toward the cameras before turning back to Joy. Next time, he said softly, maybe try listening first. And with that, he walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. Joy sat frozen in her chair, staring after him, realizing that this would be the moment everyone remembered, not for the interview she had planned, but for the lesson she had just received in front of millions of viewers. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Denzel leaned forward, his eyes locked on Joy with a calm intensity that was somehow more frightening than shouting could ever be. It looks like you invited me on your show so you could ambush me, he said evenly. His voice didn't waver, but every syllable carried weight. So you could try to make me look like some sort of radical extremist? For having the audacity to make a film about real issues that affect real people? The room went dead silent again. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Joy's face turned bright crimson, the color creeping up from her neck to her cheeks. The confident talk show host, who just minutes earlier had been smiling broadly and steering the conversation with practiced ease, now looked cornered. Her usual arsenal of charm, humor, and control had completely deserted her. I wasn't trying to, she began, her voice trembling. I just think that when someone has a platform like yours, Stop. The single word cut through her sentence like a gunshot. Denzel's tone wasn't loud, but it was final. Just stop, Joy. He leaned back slightly, shaking his head in disbelief. Every word that comes out of your mouth right now is making this worse. You're not apologizing. You're not acknowledging what you did wrong. You're just making excuses and trying to justify your behavior. The audience barely dared to breathe. The energy in the studio had shifted so dramatically that even the camera operators, seasoned professionals who'd seen their share of tense interviews, were frozen behind their lenses, afraid that even a whisper of movement would shatter the moment. A few audience members had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others sat forward on the edge of their seats, transfixed, unwilling to blink lest they miss a single word. The other hosts of The View sat in utter silence. Their cue cards were forgotten, their professional smiles gone. For once, none of them knew what to say. The set, usually buzzing with overlapping voices and rapid-fire exchanges, felt like a church at midnight. Denzel exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his tone softened, but the power behind it deepened. You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy? He asked quietly. The calm in his voice made every head turn a little closer. The real tragedy is that you had an opportunity today. You had the chance to have a real conversation about real issues. You could have asked thoughtful questions about art, about truth, about storytelling, about the responsibility we all share as people who speak to the world. He paused, letting the words sink in. But instead, he said almost sadly, you chose to turn this into a gotcha moment. You chose the headline over the heart, the spectacle over the substance. Joy swallowed hard. She could feel her throat tighten, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. "I was just trying to give viewers a balanced perspective," she managed to say, but her voice had lost its usual edge. What came out was shaky, almost pleading, a tone the audience had never heard from her before. "Balanced," Denzel repeated, his expression darkening. He leaned forward again, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Joy, there is nothing balanced about dismissing the experiences of an entire community." His voice began to rise, not in anger for anger's sake, but in passion, in conviction. "There is nothing balanced about telling someone that their truth is biased just because it makes you uncomfortable. There is nothing balanced about using your platform to silence the voices that challenge your worldview." Each sentence hit with the precision of a hammer striking steel. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel the weight of every camera, every pair of eyes in the room, focused entirely on her. And for once, it wasn't admiration she saw in them. It was disappointment. Maybe even contempt. Denzel didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or look triumphant. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, letting the silence expand between them until it filled every corner of the set. And then, something extraordinary happened. From somewhere near the back of the audience, a single pair of hands began to clap. One person, brave enough to break the silence, applauding softly at first, then louder. Another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the sound spread like wildfire. The entire studio audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, their applause rolling like thunder through the air. It wasn't just approval. It was release. It was gratitude. It was the collective sound of people acknowledging courage when they saw it. Joy's eyes darted around the studio in disbelief. This wasn't the reaction she was used to. She had expected applause for herself, for her witty comebacks and fearless questions, not for her guest, not like this. Her face went pale beneath the bright studio lights as she realized the truth. She had lost the room. The other hosts looked at each other in stunned silence, unsure what to do. One of them instinctively reached toward the control booth, maybe hoping the producers would cut to commercial, but no signal came. Even they seemed mesmerized by what was unfolding. Denzel didn't rise from his chair immediately. He waited until the applause began to fade, until the roar softened into murmurs of awe. When he finally spoke again, his tone was gentle, almost fatherly. "You see, Joy," he said quietly, "when we stop listening, when we start turning people into sound bites instead of human beings, we lose something important. We lose empathy. We lose connection. We lose the very thing that makes art and conversation worth having." Joy looked down at her notes, her hands trembling slightly. The words she'd prepared for this interview suddenly seemed meaningless, empty lines that had no place in the gravity of this moment. Denzel stood up. He didn't look angry anymore, just resolute. "I came here to talk about stories," he said softly, addressing the audience now. "Stories that matter. Stories that tell the truth about who we are. If that makes me an extremist, then maybe we need to rethink what moderation really looks like." The audience applauded again, louder this time, longer. Joy could do nothing but sit there, her eyes glistening under the harsh lights. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of a moment that would soon go viral. Dissected by every outlet, replayed in every newsroom, discussed in every living room, but right now, in this second, there was no sound except applause. No movement except Denzel's calm walk toward the edge of the set. And no question about what had just happened. He hadn't just defended himself. He had reminded everyone watching what dignity looked like. "This," Denzel said, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence like a blade, "is what happens when respect becomes a foreign concept." The words landed with the weight of final judgment. For a moment, nobody moved. The audience sat in stunned stillness, the crew frozen in place. Even the lights seemed to hum more softly, as if the entire studio were holding its breath. Then, chaos flickered to life behind the cameras. Joy Behar, her face pale and her composure completely shattered, began gesturing frantically toward the control booth. Her hand trembled as she pointed to the producers, mouthing something the microphones couldn't pick up. The panic was unmistakable. She had lost control of her own show. Two stage managers, clearly reluctant but bound by duty, emerged from behind the cameras. Their faces were stiff with discomfort, their movements cautious. They exchanged uncertain glances as they approached the host's desk, as though stepping into the aftermath of an explosion. Miss Behar, one of them said quietly, his tone polite but edged with authority. We need you to come with us. Joy turned on him, her voice sharp and cracking under pressure. What did you just say? Ma'am, the second stage manager began carefully. We have our orders. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but firm. We need to get you off the set. For a second, Joy simply stared at them, blinking as if she hadn't heard correctly. Then her voice rose, shrill, frantic, echoing through the studio. This is my show, she cried. You can't remove me from my own show. I am the host. Do you understand that? This is The View. You can't. But her words were met not with sympathy, not even with response, only silence and the soft murmur of the audience watching history unfold before them. The two stage managers exchanged another glance, then one of them stepped closer and gently took her by the arm. Please, Miss Behar, he said quietly. Let's go. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly. The audience could barely comprehend what they were seeing. Joy Behar, one of daytime television's most recognizable figures, being escorted off her own set, mid-show, while the cameras continued to roll. Her heels scraped against the polished floor as she resisted, her voice growing fainter as she was led behind the curtain. Her protests echoed from backstage, muffled, distant, and increasingly desperate. The words themselves were indistinguishable, but the tone said it all: shock, anger, humiliation. It was the sound of someone who had spent decades commanding attention, suddenly realizing she no longer had any control. Back on stage, Denzel Washington remained perfectly composed. He hadn't moved from his position at the interview table. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his jacket, then straightened his tie with calm precision. The contrast between his serenity and Joy's collapse was striking, like a still lake after a storm. He took a breath, then turned to face the camera. The studio lights reflected softly against his skin as he looked straight into the lens, not as an actor, but as a man speaking truth. The truth doesn't need to be balanced, he said quietly. The truth just needs to be told. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the gravity of a closing statement, the kind of line that etches itself into collective memory. For a heartbeat, the studio remained utterly still. Then slowly the audience began to applaud again, hesitant at first, then louder, rising like a wave. The cameras continued to roll, capturing everything: the standing ovation, the stunned faces of the remaining hosts, the empty seat where Joy Behar had been sitting just moments earlier. That vacant chair seemed to say more than words ever could, a silent monument to what had just taken place. In the control booth, a producer finally gave the signal. Cut to commercial, someone whispered. But even as the screen faded to black, no one in the studio moved. The moment lingered in the air, electric and unforgettable. Later, clips of the confrontation would spread across every social platform, replayed millions of times within hours. Viewers would argue in the comments. Journalists would write think pieces, and networks would issue statements trying to contain the fallout. But for those who had been there, those who had witnessed it live, it wasn't just another viral moment. It was something deeper. They would remember the look on Denzel's face. Calm, resolute, grounded in conviction. They would remember Joy's unraveling, the dawning realization that the conversation had slipped beyond her control. And most of all, they would remember the silence before the applause, that moment when the world seemed to hold still, balanced on the edge of truth. When the broadcast returned, the show's theme music played softly, but there was no laughter, no chatter, no easy transition. The hosts sat motionless, unsure how to proceed. One of them tried to smile into the camera, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "We'll be right back with more." But everyone knew nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, headlines called it the most explosive confrontation in daytime television history. News outlets dissected every second of footage. Was Joy Behar simply doing her job as a journalist, pushing hard questions, challenging perspectives, or had she crossed a line of basic respect? Public opinion split like glass under pressure. Some defended her, arguing that controversy was the price of truth. Others sided firmly with Denzel, calling his composure and eloquence a masterclass in grace under fire. Online, debates raged. Was it an ambush? or accountability? Was it arrogance or authenticity? Through it all, one image dominated the conversation, the final shot of the empty chair, framed under the bright studio lights. That chair became a symbol of pride, of downfall, of what happens when the pursuit of spectacle replaces the pursuit of understanding. And Denzel's words, "The truth doesn't need to be balanced. The truth just needs to be told," echoed far beyond that studio, repeated in classrooms, podcasts, and editorials as a reminder of something simple but powerful. That respect and truth are not opposing forces, but partners. The confrontation was over, but its echoes would last for years.